Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Open Network User Group podcast. I'm Mark Tierney. I'm ONUG CTO. And on today's podcast, it's policy, policy, policy. Policy is code, or as I like to call it, policy is code, more questions than answers. Will it be worth it? Are you worth it? Of course you are, and you want to be happy. You deserve to be happy, and that's why you're listening to today's podcast. But before we go there, listen up. ONUG Spring 2023 hybrid event like it has been since the Rona. It's going to be in Dallas, my hometown, Union Station, May 17th and 18th. Come join the ONUG global community, global 2,000 companies, tech execs, enterprise architects, infrastructure engineers, cloud providers, thought leaders, as we discuss and demonstrate the tenets of enterprise cloud, networking, security, policy. I mean, the list just kind of goes on and on. Go to onug.net to register for the event today. You can use a promo code ONUG podcast and you get 20% discount off the ticket price. So just go do it. Just go do it right now. Okay, you can listen to the podcast and then go do it. All right, so joining me today is Tim Hinrichs. Tim, am I saying that name correctly? Tim
You got
Hinrichs?
it. Yeah,
Nice. I nailed it. I'm just like, just going to keep track of the stuff I do right today on the podcast. So I got your name right. Awesome. And let's see if I can pronounce the name of your company. You're the co-founder and CTO of Styra. Is that correct?
You got it. Two
That's
for two.
Right. And yeah. So Tim, you're enmeshed and immersed in a lot of things policy, in particular the open policy agent and your company Styra, what it does in that space. But before we go there and we dig in the topic, you're kind of new to the community, so I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself a little bit. What's your background, man? Where do you hail from? What do you do? How would you get here?
Yeah, totally. Oh, well, thanks for having me, Mark. It's great to be here. So Tim Hinrichs, I'm CTO co-founder, like you said, Styra. I've been at Styra here for a good long while. But before Styra, I was at VMware for a number of years. Came into there through the Styra acquisition. So software-defined networking back in the day was their claim to fame. So that was great. And then so I've been and then even before that, I was at Stanford, did my PhD in policy languages. Oddly enough, didn't know that was a thing until I did it. So I've been in this policy space for about 20 years now. And I think you asked me a little bit about my hobbies, so I'll add to that.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, I want to hear that.
So I
what do nerds do?
Yeah. Well, a bunch of things I do, besides the family stuff, but certainly golf. I'm a big golfer. At least I was in the day. I don't get to play much anymore. But I was watching the Masters here. It was on right before we hopped on. So
right.
Always love to see that.
Wow. I think I played one round of golf in my life, and it was ugly. And it was at a corporate event, and no one should have to endure that, watching or hanging with me while I swing the clubs. That was brutal. All right. So, and I use the term endearingly, Tim. You are kind of a nerd, like stuff. Like you've been an engineer, right? Like you've got your doctorate, but and I should say, you've built stuff, right? So kind of tell us how you went from being like a software engineer at VMware to co-founding this company. Like how does that transition happen? That's a pretty big jump, man.
Yeah. Well, a couple of pieces to it. Like I said, I've been doing this policy thing for a long time. That's why I was at VMware and the work I did with Styra before that. And so, I was a software engineer at VMware. I spent half my time in open source. I happened to be a policy project inside OpenStack at the time. So that was cool. But then I spent the other half of my time on, one of the networking products that VMware had bought from Styra. And so, I spent all my time basically writing code. And I think but all the code that I was writing had to do with policy, right? Not surprisingly, given my background. And I think that, as part of that open source project, I was spending a lot of time talking to customers, just about, hey, what are your policy problems? And so what we heard time and time again was that, they had this very fundamental problem, which is we've got all these different solutions to policy. And so like the banks were having to build a way of managing all those different policies in different languages. So they actually asked us to go ahead and build that open source project. And so after you do that for a couple of years, and then you're writing code, then you kind of decide along with your co-founders that maybe this problem is bigger than the open source project we're working on. Maybe it's something that is pervasive throughout all of industry. And then you're like, well, I think that'd be fun. Let's go start a company and get it done. So
I think it's great.
It's a very simple story, really.
Yeah, I think it's a great story too. Filling the gaps, solving a big problem, and let's kind of talk about that for a minute. So I have a strong bias that comes from enterprise IT consumption in the financial space. 22 years at a large financial firm, and sitting in front of compliance people and auditors, on a regular basis. Dealing with compliance management, attestation, all that stuff. At the end of the day, having to do with meeting business policy, meeting technical policy, different administrative policies, and there's a lot of toil there. Number one, but I also think, to your point, there's just been a huge vacuum and lack of understanding about how this problem should line up. Where are the consistencies between organizations, and where are the gaps? And then how should organizations find best practices from a technical perspective, from a business perspective, compliance and governance? Just like, how do we do all that? And so many folks in our audience are aware of this. You may not be aware of this, but at the ONUG conferences, we have we have two conferences a year. We have a spring conference and a fall conference. And the last two conferences that we've had some closed door sessions with consumers only, enterprise IT consumers only. In both cases, the policy as code, closed door policy as code session was our most widely attended session. And it's kind of shocking, really, to think about that. But that's how big of a problem it is, and how much toil our member organization, the ONUG member organizations, see this as a problem. And so because of that, ONUG started a policy as code working group. And the purpose of any ONUG working group is to be part of a connected community. We're not it's not necessary or even necessarily interesting for us to invent stuff as much as create playbooks and methodologies and best practices to consume the solutions and services that are already out there, right? Whether they're, whether you buy them or, consume an open source thing, or maybe even build something yourself, whatever it is. It's about being part of a connected community and helping our members, consume things in a way that's helpful for them and adds value for them. And so that's where our policy as code working group came from. And in the process of that, obviously you can't have a discussion about policy as code without talking about OPA, right? Let me just ask you though, because I want to dig into all that, and at the end we're going to talk a little bit about how Styra helps with this whole problem, but. What do you feel like? What are you hearing from your customers and the open source community? Like, is there a top 2, 3 problems that you feel like the community needs solved in this policy space?
Yeah, totally. I think I'll give a couple of different answers to this. I think the first of which is sort of at a high level. I think you depicted, or you described like a broad range of different policy problems that we've seen. And so I think that the more concrete problems that I work on day in and day out. I'll get to those in a minute, but I think like that high level problem statement is worth like going through just briefly, because I think it's a generalization of all the instantiations or all the more concrete problems that we actually run into. So I kind of want to talk about both, I think. And so kind of at a high level, the policies code is sort of a synthesis of the way people solve these policy problems today. Like what I see people doing is one of two things. You've got an organizational policy that says whatever. Maybe it says you got to get approval for vacation 2 weeks in advance, or you got to get approval if your airfare is more than $500 domestically, or it's a more technical policy that says, hey, you're a developer, you're trying to deploy an application to production, you got to make sure that you've got encrypted storage, that you've got secure ports, that you've got XYZ, right? It doesn't really matter what those policies are. There are really two ways that people try to solve them, at least that I've seen. On the one hand, you've got people who just say, hey, let's just put the policies into a wiki, a PDF, an email, or whatever, and train our people to go off and know what those policies are. And then when they deploy the software, or they, ask for travel, or they book travel, they do the right thing. So that's one option A. Option B is when people say, hey, maybe that's not working or it's not efficient enough. And so they take those policies and they hard code them into software, right? And so now they've got the software that knows what the policies are, so they don't allow a booking for travel that's over $500 unless they have approval or something. And they don't allow a developer to deploy an app if it doesn't have the right network, compute, and storage property set up. And so policies code, and so that's option B. You hard code it into software, and so that's great because it's automatically enforced. But then there are obviously trade-offs. Like it's much easier to change a wiki than it is to track down all those different locations in the code that people put policy, right? That have implemented policy. And so policies code is kind of the best of both worlds. It says, look, make sure that we're going to automatically enforce those policies, but also make sure that you've decoupled those policies from the underlying software so that at the end of the day, you can change them very easily. You can read them very easily. You know they are a separable first-class citizen. Anyway, so like that's the top-level problem that I see over and over again, which is, do you take this policy, do you automatically enforce it, A, and B, do you have it separated out from the software that's doing that enforcement? And policies code kind of tries to does both of those simultaneously. I don't know.
Are you seeing trends when enterprises engage in trying to solve this problem, and all problems associated with policy? You can't do everything at once. Are you seeing trends emerge into policy areas that enterprises want to prioritize?
Totally. Yeah. And that's, when I think about what I do day in and day out, that's, it's the really two areas that I see over and over again in terms of these are the trends. These are the places where people sort of crystallize that high level problem statement that we went through. And the one is what I'll call application authorization or application policies. And so here, what I see is, imagine you're an application developer, you're building, your banking app, right? We all use banking apps. And so you're really writing policy in that case to control the actions of those end users, right? So if I'm an end user, I log into my bank, I can do things like transfer money from my account to my wife's, I can look at tax reports, I can do XYZ. All those actions are things that the developers have to decide, is this allowed or not? And they, basically have the software enforce it. And so that's one area where policies code makes sense, because what you kind of want to do at the end of the day is be able to decouple that policy from the application so you can manage that policy separately. You can even give your end users the ability to manage those policies. And so I see that happening over and over again, especially in this move to cloud and microservices, just over and over. What everybody realizes they need to do is be able to decouple policy so that that authorization logic isn't littered throughout the app. So that's like area one. Second area, the big one that I see is what I call infrastructure authorization. So high level, very similar, but in this case, imagine you're the developers now who are actually building and running that application. You're performing actions all the time too, like you're deploying your app onto Kubernetes or hooking up networking through Terraform, or you're, setting up the right storage. And so all of those actions, all those interactions you have with those public clouds, with those container systems, those are all things that you could do incorrectly, and that the organization, the business as a whole, wants to help you streamline, make sure that you're obeying PCI or whatever the compliance regulations are, or that you're making sure that you're not opening up security holes, or that you're not violating best practices operationally, just in terms of how you use Kug with a public cloud. And so that's the second area that we see over and over again, people wanting to put policies in place, or we sometimes call them guardrails so that developers can move as quickly as possible while using those clouds.
Is securing an S3 bucket just a punchline now? Like, is that kind of where we're at? Like,
yeah, I think so.
I just left it open.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a good example for sure.
Wow. Okay. So I guess I'm not surprised necessarily, but I wasn't expecting, I guess that's the same thing as surprise, about the external user policy management. That's interesting. I completely, the idea about, managing, sort of administrative policy from the inside makes tons of sense. I wasn't thinking about implementing policies code and policy management from an end user perspective. That also makes a lot of sense. Just hadn't thought of it. So that's fascinating. That also strikes me as a user experience value prop too. Right now I'm giving and enabling cool policy functionality, easy use, all that kind of stuff. And isn't that what everybody's trying to really accomplish in, today's, cloud computing? How can I be agile? How can I deploy functionality and improve, user experience and do it fast, right? So that makes a lot of sense. Wow.
Yeah, it was. I was just going to tie this back to our earlier discussion about, when we created the company, what we saw was everybody was moving to these microservice and cloud-based infrastructures, right? So it's super easy to run your application in every region on the planet. All you need is a CI tool and somebody writing code. But what that means is that now you've given, the developers keys to the kingdom, keys to those production services. And so now how do you make sure that they're all doing the right things from a security operations and compliance point of view, A, and then B, what we also saw was just the rise of these like mega applications, right? When we go online now, we go into, AWS or any of the public clouds, obviously, but even just, other tools like in the finance realm, like how big is the Salesforce collection of software? It's enormous. Right. And so as we as an industry just build larger and larger applications, a simple, check at the front door, can Tim access Salesforce? It just isn't going to cut it anymore. You're going to need finer and finer granular controls, authorization controls within that application to just make it usable for enterprises. So anyway, we saw all these megatrends coming, and that's, I think, why at the end of the day, we're seeing so much interest around policies code right now.
Okay, so clearly there's a demand. Clearly there's an opportunity there. I see the business side of this. Just it makes perfect sense. Why OPA? Tell us about OPA. How did why do this open source? What was driving your thinking there, and how do you get there?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's a good question. When we in the very early days, very start of the company, we knew that one of the key technical pieces that was necessary for policies code or for to help us solve, these application infrastructure problems was a language that would allow people to express those policies, regardless of what the policy was. So if it's a policy about end users transferring money, fine. If it's a policy about, which developers can deploy which network configurations into which clusters, fine, right? But the idea was that we need a language to express all those policies, and that has to be something outside of like Java or Go or Ruby, right? It's got to be a dedicated policy language, because at the end of the day, we wanted people to be able to focus on writing policy, like the logic behind it. If you go take any of those legal documents that maybe are much too long for even people to read, there's still at the end of the day some core logic that you're expressing there around like what this contract says. So we needed a way to crystallize and allow people to write policies in a dedicated sort of file format is how I think about it at a low level, but that could also be read and understood by machines, right? That's kind of the deal behind policy as code. So you want people to write it and read it, but you also want machines to be able to enforce it. And so you need to have those two things. And that was really the genesis of OPA, right? When I think about what OPA is, Open Policy Agent, it really is fundamentally that policy language combined with an engine where if you take a file that's written in that language and you hand it over to the engine and you start asking a bunch of questions, can Tim withdraw money from this account? It can provide you answers. And then you need tooling as well to just sort of manipulate and test and understand what those policies are saying. So that really is OPA, and it solves the core central issue of this idea of policy as code.
So when we talk about it, when often I'm in conversations about this, it feels like we're mostly talking about implementation, policy, policy from an implementation perspective. My belief, so I'm gonna put it out there. I want you to tell me I'm wrong, or and if I am, why I'm getting it wrong. Or confirm, yeah, this is missing in the discussion. I feel like there's more to policy than day one implementation. I mean, certainly, preparation, definitions, all those things are important. But when it comes to, and again, this is just sort of the life I led at a large financial, was after the policy, maintaining policy, attesting to policy. Those are real things too, right? It's not just about implementing. Am I wrong? Are these still gaps in the marketplace today? Are organizations still struggling with that?
I agree with you that there's far more to the let's say the vision of policy as code than simply, I'll use OPA as an example, then tossing OPA out in the environment, hooking it up to some other software system to actually enforce decisions, and then loading it with policy, right? I mean, that's the bare minimum that you need to do to kind of like get something kind of turning over to convince yourself it would work. There's, the way I usually think about it is that there's a whole life cycle that you need to care about, right? Like that's day zero that it's not even really day one. It's not even in production at that point. That's just the minimum you need to do to try things out. To put it into production, you've got to go through all the things you normally would for a tier 0 service, right? And let's be clear, like authorization is one of the most critical components in an environment. Because if authorization goes down, let's take an app, for example. If you've got all of your app asking for authorization decisions from OPA, like OPA can't disappear. It can't suddenly stop giving you answers because then the entire app becomes a brick, right? The app doesn't know what to do. It can't allow things through because that's a security problem. It can't not perform the actions because at the end of the day, then it does nothing, right? And so authorization is a crucial service. Obviously, therefore, there's a lot that goes into actually running and maintaining that in production. And that's just like to your point, that's still just implementation. And then you've got to think about all the management outside of that, all that policy lifecycle management. So you got to make sure that people can write policy, they can test it, they can deploy it, they can monitor the results, they can log all the answers. And even then, you got to think about all of the different stakeholders throughout the company that all care about policy, which is why I think it's so important to have it coupled to begin with, right? It's not just whoever the developer who's writing the app. It's the security team is doing security reviews. It's the compliance team as well. So, it's a product manager. It's the end user at the end of the day, especially for that application case, that cares a lot about making sure that authorization policy does the right thing and reveals the right information at the right time to the right people. So it's I think that part of the allure of policy as code is that because you've decoupled it, you can get all these different stakeholders looking at and contributing to that policy without them all being, having to review reams and reams of traditional programming code. You can even provide different interfaces for those different personas. Like some people just want to see at a high level, hey, what are the compliance regulations that we put in place? Others want to look and control the intimate details. But I agree with you. There's a whole tremendous amount of ecosystem around policies.
When you started standing up OPA, did you have what were your biggest surprises? And put you on the spot, like anything that just came out of left field you didn't see coming at all in terms of standing up an open source initiative in this for this particular space. Anything that just wow, I wasn't looking for that. What happened?
I'm trying to think. Well, one of the things that popped to mind initially, this was more just around, I guess, adoption, right? I mean, you build an open source project, and certainly you spend, I think one thing that people don't realize is that you spend in the early days, you spend a lot of time building the software, but you also spend a lot of time talking to people about it, right? It's not like you just
building community, that kind of stuff.
It's not like you just flip a bit, and it's like some people will say, I open sourced, past tense, my project, and I'm like, well, that means you flip a bit on GitHub. There's a lot more that you're going to have to do to make that successful. But anyway, so there's a lot of time you put into it, and I definitely remember it was a pleasant surprise. There was a time where in the beginning, like, nobody's heard of it, and so you just educate people all the time, and then suddenly it was awesome to see people say, "Oh no, I know what OPA is," the first time you talk to them. And then there was definitely a moment where suddenly it became my expectation that anybody I was talking to, that there were multiple teams within the organization that were using Open, that this person I was talking to should know the other teams that were using it.
Oh, yeah, that doesn't work at some of these large enterprises. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, right?
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Hey, so was there a distribution of the community that was stronger than the other? In other words, have you found more enterprise consumers interested in OPA, or more suppliers, software suppliers, or is it even mix? How's it shaking down right now?
Yeah, it's hard to guess what the like mix is at this point, just because it's everywhere. We see it in so many vendor tools now, but then on the more the customer, the user side, we see it everywhere as well. So I think in the early days, it was customers first. It was users of software that just needed to solve policy as code problems, and I think what happened was there were a good number of those that came out and talked publicly about how they were using OPA, and then that drew more people in. I think Netflix was one of the very earliest talks that took OPA and applied it to policies, to application authorization for microservices. And then I think we had I think Intuit was another one that came out but applied it to infrastructure as code. And so I think that seeing those people come at KubeCon and talk just led naturally to more customers trying it out. And then once there were enough of those, I think then we started seeing more vendors pick it up. And then once there were enough vendors picking it up, that kind of got the word out even faster. And then there were more end users, and now it's kind of like one of those virtuous cycles. So in the end, I don't know what the breakdown is, but but it's everywhere. Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, so let's talk about Styra, and what your organization is doing. What are you doing with OPA, and why you're amazing.
Well, very good. All right. So Styra, we're committed to helping enterprises adopt OPA. And we do that in a couple of different ways. So, we've got support for OPA. Obviously we're the creators, we're some of the maintainers of OPA. So it's a very natural thing for us to do. We also have just recently announced this enterprise grade distribution of OPA. So we're just adding integrations into it. We're adding some live testing, so you can go ahead and launch draft policies in and kind of see the impact of those policies before you kind of flip the switch and make them production. And then we've added some, optimizations for memory and CPU to save, 10x memory in some data heavy use cases. So anyway, enterprise grade distribution of OPA. And then we also have sort of this end-to-end control plane for OPA. Sometimes, we talked about policy lifecycle management. It does complete policy lifecycle management sort of out of the box, and has a bunch of pre-built integrations for some of the more popular use cases for OPA, Kubernetes, Terraform, service mesh, gateways, and so on and so forth.
All right. So is there a cloud play here somewhere? What is your how does the Styra product interoperate with cloud deployments, specifically, or multi-cloud or hybrid multi-cloud, or what? Is there a story there, or is it just so it doesn't even matter? Like it just your product can assist in managing policy across all these different domains simultaneously.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea, right? One of the great things about OPA is it was designed to be domain agnostic, so you can apply it to really any kind of policy use case that you like. All you need to do is kind of integrate OPA with, your cloud platform or your application. And then, yeah, exactly. So the way our commercial product work is, well, it's either a drop-in replacement for OPA, which that's very clear. Anywhere you use OPA, you could use our enterprise version of OPA. But in the policy management space, then yeah, the kind of idea behind OPA is that you run a bunch of OPAs. They're pretty inexpensive to run, and so you could run tens, hundreds, thousands of OPAs. Integrated as deeply into your applications and infrastructure as you like. And then DAS will simply connect to all those OPAs and help you, write the policies for them, just deploy the policies to all of the OPAs. So it doesn't matter whether the OPAs are running on-prem, on your Raspberry Pi, and in your cloud. They just all kind of connect up into our control plane. And then, from your point of view, from a user's point of view, you just have that single pane of glass into here are all the OPAs, here's the policies they're enforcing, here are the decisions that are being made. And so it wraps it all up together in a very simple management plane.
All right, so back to the management discussion, since I was whining about that earlier. So I've deployed policy using your product. How do I manage that after the fact? How do I know that policy's still in place? How do I attest to it? How do I know it's not drifted? Like, how does that work?
Yep. So the way this works is you'll, and this is sort of the protocol built into OPA, which is that OPA is continuously phoning home and saying, "Hey, give me the latest policies, give me the latest data that I need in order to make my decisions." And so that happens every minute or two, right? And so, once you've actually deployed your policy, then that single pane of glass that you have is an up-to-date view of what's been deployed. And yes, you can go ahead and you integrate with Git and go ahead and go through approval processes for those policies, just like a bunch of folks normally would. But yeah, in terms of like understanding drift, understanding what's really there, that's kind of the goal of that control plane, is that it gives you sort of like a what you see is what you get interface for modeling and managing policies.
Do you have any, I don't know, scale issues? What practical limits? What's in the way of of going bigger, going deeper, whatever it is? Do you have any scale issues that you're challenged with right now? What are the biggest obstacles for the product right now?
Scales infinitely. I absolutely, obviously, there's no.
Yeah. Okay.
No, it is distributed. It is like a distributed model in the sense that, the great thing about the entire OPA architecture is that OPA is responsible for making all the decisions. And so it's not like it needs a phone home to get, information to make an actual authorization decision. And so in that sense, it scales. It's a completely distributed decision-making architecture. And then, at the DAS level, then there's questions around, how many hundreds of, or maybe even how many thousands of OPAs do you need before we, start seeing challenges? And honestly, we've not seen challenges at this point around the number of OPAs. We're always making sure we stay ahead of what customers need and what they're deploying in that dimension. And then the other one is kind of like how many different, sometimes we call them use cases, do we support today? And so I think we've got, probably 5 core use cases. So like that'd be Kubernetes and Terraform and Envoy, and maybe a couple others. And then there are a few others that are kind of newer and recenter. And the good news is, of course, that we do have this sort of custom do it yourself version. So if we don't have what you need, then in that dimension, you're welcome to go ahead and hook up any kind of OPA for any kind of use case, and we'll go ahead and help you manage the policies for that as well.
All right. So like if I want to, if I go to the and this may not be fair, but if I look at the Open Policy Agent website, openpolicyagent.org, and I look at the different domains where you live, in theory, right? And it just sort of, Kubernetes, containers, et cetera, cloud. Like, what does that mean? Like, what does cloud mean? That's a lot. There's a lot there, right? What is, is there like a top five list of policy, cloud policy that you're enabling at this point? Is that a fair question?
Well, yeah, it's sorry, yeah. If you go to the Open Policy Agent website, you're going to the Open ecosystem page, right? Is that what you were?
Right. Well,
Yeah,
it's just
yeah.
openpolicyagent.org, right? So.
Oh, you just went to the homepage even. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So if you click on the ecosystem, so the homepage is illustrative, right? That was supposed to be there, and that hasn't changed for a couple of years.
Gotcha.
But that gives you a sense as to the different places that you can actually go ahead and deploy OPA to make progress around policies code. But if you want to see more of the concrete list of integrations that we as well as the community have done with OPA, then you click on that ecosystem page, and that gives you a more
Gotcha.
fine-grained understanding of like, concretely where has OPA been deployed, so I'll cherry pick a couple there. So like if you look at Kubernetes or Envoy or Kafka, like all of those have this kind of property where you can kind of just configure each of those and say, hey, anytime you need to make an authorization decision, go send that decision over to OPA, right? So you run whatever, Kube or Envoy or Kafka, you run OPA as part of it or close to it, and then you just kind of point the Kube, Envoy or Kafka at that OPA. And then you're using OPA to do policies code, make authorization decisions for that piece of software, and it gets enforced. And so, yeah, nice. I kind of lost the thread on your question though.
Yeah, no worries. No. Really, it was just more about what specific areas. Well, maybe let me ask it a different way. Are there some specific areas? So what do you want to do next? Like, what's exciting you now about the next part of the ecosystem that you're hoping to enable? Is that a fair question?
Yeah. It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, there's so many different. It's kind of a double-edged sword. It's like you can apply OPA to solve so many different authorization policy problems. It's wonderful, right? That's why you've got a page there of, I thought it was around 100 different integrations, right? With all kinds of different software systems, from custom applications to all different kinds of infrastructure, CI/CD pipelines, service meshes, gateways, and so on and so forth. So it's exciting. There's so many things you can do with it. And obviously, as a startup, you're always trying to focus on the things that are most important and that move the needle the most. And so, when I was talking about infrastructure and application authorization, those it's sort of simultaneously are broad enough that they really do get people excited. But they're also narrow enough that you can make progress on. So that's a lot of what we focus on. And then obviously the new thing, or the relatively new thing, is this work that we're doing around the enterprise version of OPA, right, which we call Styra Load. So that's also exciting because it sort of allows us to innovate both at the data plane, right, the software that's making authorization decisions, as well as the control plane, which we've obviously been working on for years.
Nice, man. This has been seriously, Tim, very informative. I appreciate this so much. Give you a last word, last shot. What do you want to tell? What do you want to tell the audience about Styra and how to get involved?
Yeah, for sure. Well, definitely get involved. If you haven't already, check out the Open Policy Agent website, active Slack community. Definitely hop on there and go to Styra's website, styra.com. Interact with us. We're happy to chat, happy to help in however you need in order to, adopt OPA. That's what we're all about these days.
Perfect, man. It's been very informative, and again, as most of our viewers and listeners know, this just aligns so well with what we're doing in the Policies Code working group at ONUG. Don't forget to get involved with the working groups. You can go to onug.net and click on collaborative and find out more and more about what's happening. There are some powerhouse companies that are involved in the ONUG collaborative working on this particular issue right now, and we're just part of a connected community. We're not trying to go off and invent new things when new things don't need to be invented. So we're talking about things like OPA and everything else, Policies Code, all the time. Also, a reminder: don't forget again about the ONUG Spring Conference, May 17th and 18th in Dallas at Union Station. Go to onug.net. Use the promo code ONUG Podcast to get a truckload of money savings off the ticket. And on behalf of Tim and myself, thanks for listening to today's ONUG podcast. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Mark.